California spent years convincing people that home prices could only go one direction, up, forever. But 2026 is starting to crack that illusion. Across the state, cities that once triggered insane bidding wars are suddenly seeing price cuts, rising inventory, and homes sitting unsold for weeks. And the weird part? Some of these places were supposed to be recession-proof. What nobody tells you is housing markets don't collapse all at once. They soften quietly first. One price cut, one empty listing. One seller realizing the pandemic frenzy is over. And in California, that realization is spreading fast. Number 1, Oakland, California. Oakland is what happens when a housing market rises too fast, too aggressively, and eventually runs out of people who can realistically afford to keep the illusion going. For years, this city rode the Bay Area wave hard. Tech money flooded outward from San Francisco, remote workers chased relatively cheaper neighborhoods, investors piled in, and prices exploded. During the pandemic boom especially, Oakland housing surged like it had permanently escaped economic gravity. But now, the correction is becoming impossible to ignore. Recent housing reports show Oakland experiencing some of the fastest home value declines in the country. And honestly, the reasons aren't complicated. The Bay Area tech economy slowed, layoffs hit, remote work changed how people value proximity to expensive urban cores. Rising interest rates crushed affordability, and suddenly, buyers stopped behaving like prices could only move upward forever. But here's the weird part. Oakland's decline isn't happening because the city lacks advantages. This place still has culture, transit access, restaurants, nightlife, history, proximity to Silicon Valley, and neighborhoods that once represented the next big thing. The problem is the math stopped making emotional sense. When ordinary homes push toward absurd pricing territory, eventually buyers start asking a dangerous question. Wait, why am I paying this much? And once enough people ask that, at the same time, momentum reverses fast. Add rising inventory, growing concerns around crime perception, and the psychological exhaustion people feel toward Bay Area living costs. And the market starts cooling hard. One Reddit user described Oakland perfectly. It used to feel expensive because it was growing. Now it just feels expensive. And that tiny emotional shift changes everything. Because housing markets don't crash when prices are high. They crash when belief disappears. Number 2, San Francisco, California. For years, San Francisco operated like the laws of economics no longer applied there. Tiny condos sold for prices that could buy mansions in most of America. Buyers waived inspections like they were signing concert tickets. Tech wealth flooded every neighborhood, and the entire city developed this psychological certainty that housing would just keep rising forever because, well, it was San Francisco. But 2026 feels very different. The city is still enormously wealthy, obviously. The money didn't disappear. What disappeared was urgency. And housing markets are way more dependent on urgency than people realize. Once buyers stop panicking, everything slows down. That's exactly what remote work did to San Francisco. During the ultra-frenzy years, proximity was everything. People tolerated outrageous housing costs because being near tech campuses, venture capital networks, and high-paying jobs felt essential. But once remote and hybrid work became normalized, demand patterns changed fundamentally. Suddenly, buyers started questioning whether paying massive premiums to live inside dense urban neighborhoods still made sense. And condos got hit especially hard. Inventory started building, listings sat longer, price reductions became more common. Not catastrophic collapse, but something psychologically worse for sellers: hesitation. Because San Francisco housing was never just about shelter. It was about momentum, it was about belief. And once belief weakens, the emotional engine behind the market starts cooling. That's why the city feels strange right now. Restaurants are still packed. Tech companies still exist. Wealth is still everywhere. But the unstoppable upward pressure isn't. One local described it perfectly online. The city still feels rich. It just doesn't feel invincible anymore. And honestly, that may be the real correction happening here. Not just prices, adjusting expectations. Because San Francisco spent years behaving like gravity was optional. Now the market is slowly remembering gravity exists. Number 3, San Jose, California. San Jose is still the most expensive major housing market in America. And weirdly, that's exactly why it's becoming vulnerable. Because once prices reach a certain level, the market stops behaving like normal real estate and starts behaving like financial extreme sports. During the low interest rate era, buyers could rationalize it. Tech salaries were exploding, stock compensation was everywhere, and borrowing money felt cheap enough to sustain absurd home prices. But once mortgage rates climbed, the math broke almost instantly. In a market like San Jose, even a small rate increase can add thousands of dollars to monthly payments. And suddenly, homes that already felt expensive start looking completely detached from reality. That's why recent reports started showing San Jose among the major metros seeing noticeable price declines. Not because demand disappeared entirely, but because affordability finally hit a wall. And when you combine that with tech layoffs, slower hiring, and reduced startup confidence across Silicon Valley, buyer psychology shifts fast. People stop rushing, offers get delayed, inventory builds quietly. Sellers start realizing the pandemic frenzy isn't coming back anytime soon. What nobody tells you is ultra-expensive housing markets survive on confidence more than fundamentals. Buyers need to believe future growth will justify today's insane prices. The second that belief weakens, momentum starts collapsing under its own weight. And San Jose feels trapped inside that transition right now. The wealth is still there. The tech ecosystem still exists. But the emotional energy changed. During the boom years, people feared missing out. Now they fear overpaying. That's a completely different market. One local online described it perfectly. A few years ago, everyone asked how fast prices would rise. Now everyone asks how long they should wait. And honestly, that single question tells you everything. Because housing markets don't just run on money, they run on emotion. And right now, Silicon Valley feels exhausted. Number 4, Sacramento, California. Sacramento spent the pandemic years acting like California's great housing escape plan. People fled San Francisco, Oakland, and Silicon Valley chasing something that sounded impossible in modern California, slightly more space for slightly less money. Remote work turned proximity into an optional feature, and suddenly Sacramento exploded. Buyers flooded in, prices surged, investors moved fast. Entire neighborhoods started behaving like they were the next major growth frontier. And for a while, it worked. The city became one of America's hottest migration boomtowns almost overnight. But now the mood is changing, and the housing market is starting to show it. Recent data showed Sacramento experiencing elevated contract cancellation rates, meaning buyers are backing out of deals before closing. And that's important because cancellations usually reveal something deeper than price declines alone. They reveal hesitation. Buyers start second-guessing the numbers. Mortgage payments feel heavier. Economic uncertainty creeps in. The emotional certainty that powered the boom begins fading. And housing markets hate uncertainty. What nobody tells you is speculative momentum is incredibly fragile. Once buyers stop believing prices will rise endlessly, the urgency disappears almost immediately. Now, obviously, Sacramento isn't collapsing. This isn't some abandoned market spiraling into disaster. The city still has government jobs, healthcare, universities, infrastructure, and population growth advantages. But the energy changed. During the pandemic frenzy, Sacramento felt like California's smart move, a cheaper alternative before prices caught up. Now people are realizing even the affordable parts of California became expensive fast, especially once higher interest rates entered the picture. Sacramento used to feel cheaper than the Bay Area. Now it just feels slightly less impossible. And honestly, that's the danger for markets built on migration momentum. Once affordability stops feeling obvious, the entire growth story starts weakening. Number 5, Riverside, California. Riverside became one of the biggest symbols of pandemic-era housing migration. And honestly, the logic made sense at the time. Los Angeles prices were already absurd. Remote work suddenly made commuting less important. And buyers desperate for space started flooding inland markets, looking for anything that still felt remotely attainable. Riverside absorbed that pressure fast. Prices surged. Competition intensified. Homes disappeared from the market almost instantly. And for a while, it looked like inland California had discovered an endless growth cheat code. But the problem with rapid migration booms is they often outrun economic reality. And that's exactly what Riverside is dealing with now. Because once interest rates climbed, the math changed brutally fast. Buyers who barely stretched into the market during low-rate years suddenly faced monthly payments that looked completely different. And Riverside got hit especially hard. because so much of its demand came from affordability, refugees, people leaving even more expensive cities rather than people being pulled in by explosive local wage growth. That distinction matters. When a market depends heavily on displaced buyers, confidence becomes fragile. The second affordability weakens again, demand softens quickly. That's why recent reports identified Riverside among California metros, seeing elevated canceled transactions. Buyers are hesitating. Deals are falling apart. And hesitation is usually the first warning sign that momentum already peaked. What nobody tells you is inland boomtowns often experience housing whiplash. They rise incredibly fast because they feel cheaper than nearby major cities. But once prices climb too far, they lose the exact advantage that fueled their growth in the first place. Riverside now feels trapped in that transition. Still expensive relative to local incomes, but no longer cheap enough to feel like an obvious escape from Los Angeles. People moved to Riverside for breathing room and accidentally brought LA prices with them. And honestly, that's basically the entire pandemic housing market explained in one sentence. Number 6, Los Angeles, California. Los Angeles still has one of the strongest long-term housing markets on Earth. That's what makes the slowdown so interesting. Because this isn't some weak city suddenly collapsing under pressure. This is one of the wealthiest, most culturally dominant real estate markets in America. And even here, buyers are starting to hesitate. Recent months have already shown multiple price declines across Southern California. And the reason comes down to something surprisingly simple. Eventually, even rich people start doing math. During the ultra-low rate years, buyers tolerated insane prices because borrowing money felt almost painless. But now, mortgage rates stay high, insurance costs keep climbing, property taxes remain brutal, and the total monthly cost of ownership starts looking psychologically exhausting even for high earners. And Los Angeles runs heavily on psychology. The city has always sold more than houses. It sells status, proximity, weather, industry access, lifestyle, identity. People convinced themselves the premiums were justified because LA represented opportunity and scarcity at the same time. But once affordability pressure intensifies long enough, even emotional markets cool down. That's especially visible in luxury inventory right now. High-end homes are sitting longer, sellers are cutting prices more often. Buyers still exist, obviously, but the panic buying energy is gone. And without urgency, expensive markets suddenly feel very different. What nobody tells you is housing corrections in places like Los Angeles rarely start with collapse. They start with resistance. Buyers pause. Listings accumulate quietly. Open houses become less crowded. Sellers stop getting 10 offers in a weekend and start negotiating again like it's 2018. The market isn't dead, it's just humbled. And honestly, that might be the best way to describe Los Angeles right now. Not crashing into ruin, but slowly adjusting to the uncomfortable reality that even endless demand has limits when the cost of existing starts feeling financially absurd. Number 7, San Diego, California. San Diego spent the pandemic years looking almost unstoppable. Remote workers flooded in, wealthy buyers chased coastal lifestyle markets, and people convinced themselves that sunshine alone justified basically any housing price. For a while, it worked. The city became one of the hottest housing boom markets in America. Prices surged aggressively, bidding wars became normal, and entire neighborhoods started operating on pure fear of missing out. But now, San Diego has a completely different problem. It became too expensive even for people who desperately want to live there. And that's a dangerous place for any housing market to end up. Recent reports showed San Diego among the major metros experiencing some of the sharpest price declines. And honestly, the explanation is brutal but simple. Mortgage math finally overwhelmed emotion. Because San Diego still has enormous demand, the beaches didn't disappear. The weather is still perfect. The military presence, biotech jobs, tourism economy, and lifestyle appeal are all still there. But once rates climbed, monthly payments reached levels that started shocking even high-income buyers. What nobody tells you is ultra desirable cities can still weaken when affordability crosses into psychological absurdity. At some point, buyers stop asking, do I want this? And start asking, can I survive this financially? That's when momentum changes. And San Diego feels caught inside that transition right now. Listings are lingering longer, sellers are adjusting expectations, buyers are hesitating instead of rushing. During the boom years, people feared getting priced out forever. Now they fear locking themselves into giant monthly payments right before the market cools further. Number 8, Stockton, California. Stockton has always behaved like California's housing pressure valve. When Bay Area prices become unbearable, buyers spill outward, searching for anything remotely affordable, and Stockton absorbs that wave fast. That's why this market historically reacts aggressively to housing cycles. During cheap money years, Stockton booms hard because people suddenly believe they can stretch farther inland and still make the numbers work. And during the pandemic frenzy, that exact pattern exploded again. Buyers flooded in, prices surged, homes disappeared quickly. The city started feeling like another next big thing, market riding California's affordability crisis. But then rates climbed above 6%, and the entire equation changed almost overnight. Because Stockton's biggest vulnerability has always been the gap between housing prices and local incomes. On paper, homes here still look cheaper than San Francisco or San Jose. But cheaper doesn't mean affordable once borrowing costs explode. Monthly payments started rising so aggressively that buyer demand weakened almost immediately. And unlike luxury coastal markets driven heavily by wealth, Stockton depends much more on middle-class financing power. That means interest rates hit harder here emotionally and financially. What nobody tells you is markets built on stretched affordability usually reverse faster once conditions tighten, because the buyers entering these markets were already operating near their limits. And you can feel that shift happening now. Inventory sits longer, competition cooled. Sellers who expected pandemic-level offers are suddenly confronting a very different reality. Stockton still has logistics, jobs, Central Valley connections, and proximity advantages relative to the Bay Area. But the speculative momentum that fueled the boom clearly faded. Number 9, Modesto, California. Modesto became one of California's biggest remote work boomtowns almost by accident. During the pandemic frenzy, buyers poured into inland markets, looking for escape routes from Bay Area prices. And Modesto suddenly looked reasonable compared to places where starter homes already crossed into financial insanity. Bigger houses, more space, lower prices, at least relative to coastal California. And once remote work normalized, people convinced themselves long commutes didn't matter anymore because maybe they'd only need to drive into the office occasionally. That belief sent demand surging fast. But now, the emotional momentum behind that migration wave is cooling hard. Because what nobody tells you is boomtown markets depend heavily on psychological pressure. Buyers need to feel urgency. They need to believe waiting will only make things worse. But once mortgage rates climbed and affordability tightened, that pressure started fading. And Modesto is now seeing the consequences in real time. Price reductions have become increasingly common. Listings are sitting longer. Buyers are regaining negotiating leverage they completely lost during the pandemic years. Sellers who expected 10 competing offers are now adjusting to a market where people actually hesitate before spending massive amounts of money. That's a huge shift emotionally. The city itself still functions. Agriculture, logistics, healthcare, and Central Valley commerce continue supporting the region. But housing markets don't just run on local economies anymore. They run on migration narratives. And Modesto's narrative weakened once remote work stopped feeling limitless and borrowing costs started hurting. One online comment, number 10, Fresno, California. Fresno spent years sitting in this strange middle category inside California housing. It wasn't cheap by national standards, obviously, but compared to Los Angeles, San Jose, or San Diego, it still looked almost manageable. That relative affordability became a magnet after 2020. Pandemic migration, remote work flexibility, investor buying, and low interest rates all collided at once. And suddenly, Fresno prices surged far faster than the local economy realistically justified. Homes that used to feel attainable for middle-class families started climbing aggressively. And for a while, buyers kept chasing the market upward out of pure fear of being locked out permanently. But now that momentum is fading, and the cooling feels very noticeable across the Central Valley. Because Fresno's boom depended heavily on conditions that no longer exist, cheap borrowing disappeared. Investors started pulling back. Mortgage payments became dramatically more expensive, and buyers who once rushed into deals started slowing down and recalculating everything. The city still has agriculture, logistics, healthcare, universities, and a massive regional population base. This isn't some collapsing ghost market, but compared to the pandemic frenzy years, Central Valley housing looks much weaker overall.